I had rehearsed this morning carefully, as if a neat shirt and polished shoes might armor me for what was waiting inside that office. The will reading was never about money for me. It was about respect, about being acknowledged for the years I'd poured into holding this family together. I walked in believing I would simply sit where I belonged and endure the formality. But belonging, I discovered, was not something everyone agreed on. Tell me, have you ever felt someone try to erase your place in your own family, as if your years of sacrifice counted for nothing? I watched my daughter lower herself into the chair that had always been mine. She didn't even glance at me, not once, before settling in as though it had always been hers. My instinct was to speak, to reclaim what was mine, but instead I stayed quiet. I thought silence would preserve peace, that letting her have this small victory would cost me nothing. Then the executor cleared his throat, looked directly at her, and asked for her identification. The executor's question hung in the air longer than it should have. My daughter's hands fumbled for a moment, shuffling papers that weren't hers, as though noise could buy her time. I sat a step back, close enough to watch, but far enough that I felt invisible. My silence, meant as a gift of peace, had now turned into something else, a front-row seat to her unraveling. The room was too warm, the kind of heavy air that made people impatient. My other children shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. I noticed their sideways glances at me, at her, at the empty seat that should have been mine. No one said anything outright, but the weight of judgment was there. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to let this play out. I thought about how easily she had claimed that chair without hesitation, like someone claiming a prize. It wasn't the wood and leather that mattered. It was what it symbolized. Years of late bills paid, sacrifices made quietly, food stretched when money was tight, all so she could have more. And now, without acknowledgement, she slid into my place as though the history behind it belonged to her. What struck me most was her confidence. She didn't even look around the table before sitting, no pause, no second guess. Confidence like that doesn't come from respect, it comes from entitlement. I knew the difference. Respect is given, earned over years. Entitlement is taken, as if the world owes you. The executor cleared his throat again, the kind of deliberate sound meant to reclaim authority. "I'll need identification before we proceed," he said. His voice was even, not unkind, but final. My daughter froze. Her expression flickered, and for a brief second, I saw a child again. The child who once clung to me when storms shook the windows. That image clashed with the grown woman in front of me who now pretended storms didn't exist. The silence stretched longer than I expected. She didn't have her wallet, she didn't prepare. She had assumed no one would question her, that taking the seat was enough. I felt the room shift. Siblings leaned back in their chairs, some smirking, others trying to look neutral, but failing. A cousin coughed into her hand, a poor attempt at hiding amusement. For the first time in years, I felt the current tilt in my favor without me saying a word. Still, I couldn't enjoy it. This wasn't victory, it was exposure. Watching her falter wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was recognition, for someone to say, that chair is his because he built this family from the ground up. Instead, all I had was a hollow sense of being right while my daughter looked smaller by the second. Memories pressed in. I remembered when she was younger, how she once asked me why I worked so late. I told her, "So you don't have to." That was the answer I gave, over and over, even when I was bone-tired. Did she remember, or had she filed those years away under the category of things parents are supposed to do? The executor finally broke the pause. "We can continue, but you'll need to provide proof before anything is finalized." His tone was professional, but the message was sharp. "You can't take what isn't verified." She nodded quickly, her jaw tight, her pride cracked. I stayed silent. Part of me wanted to reach across to soften the sting, but another part knew this was her lesson to learn. My silence, once mistaken for weakness, now had a different weight. It forced her to face herself without my protection. The meeting stumbled forward, but the air had changed. That one question, that small demand for proof, had exposed everything. Who belonged, who pretended, and who had built the ground we all stood on. And yet, inside me, there was no sense of triumph. Only a question that gnawed quietly. How did it come to this? How did sacrifice turn into expectation and love into entitlement? I wanted to understand. I wanted to believe it wasn't as simple as arrogance. But as I watched her stare down at papers she didn't prepare for, I couldn't help but feel the truth. Somewhere along the way, my giving had taught her to take without asking. The executor's pen scratched across the page, and the sound marked the beginning of what I knew would be a long, bitter afternoon. That single request for identification had unsettled more than just my daughter. It lingered in the air, a reminder that assumptions wouldn't carry the day. I could see it in the shifting of bodies, the clearing of throats, the sudden caution in how everyone adjusted their posture. No one said it outright, but the message was clear. Nothing was going to be handed over without proof. As I watched, I thought about an silence. Mine had been a shield, a way to avoid conflict in a family that too often looked at me as if I were in the way. I believed stepping back would soften sharp edges, but in this moment, silence felt more like surrender. Still, I stayed quiet, letting the discomfort speak louder than my words ever could. My daughter kept her eyes down, flipping through the documents on the table, though they meant little without the authority she wanted to claim. I wondered what had driven her to sit there so quickly. Was it anger? Was it pride? Or had I, through years of giving, trained her to think she could take without asking? I remembered the nights when she was young, nights when I'd come home from work too late to eat dinner but still managed to sit by her bed. She'd ask why I always looked tired. I'd say, "Because I want you to have better." Back then, she smiled, satisfied with the answer. I don't know when that smile turned into expectation, when effort stopped being a gift and became invisible. The executor cleared his throat again, not to challenge her this time, but to steady the room. He began reading the formal opening of the will, and the rhythm of his voice gave the air a mechanical weight. My other children listened carefully, their expressions caught between calculation and unease. Every line was a reminder that this wasn't about love. It was about paper, signatures, and what those signatures now commanded. Inside me, a question kept scratching. Had I lost my place by giving too much ground? Did stepping back from small battles allow this bigger one to slip away? I wanted to believe my silence was strength, but the hollow feeling in my chest told me otherwise. The executor paused, scanning the table as if checking whether everyone was listening. My daughter shifted again, adjusting her papers like armor. Her face was calm on the surface, but I knew her well enough to see the tension in her jaw. She was holding on to the image of control, even as it cracked. I glanced around the room. Some of the others watched her with quiet satisfaction, waiting for her to stumble. Others avoided my eyes, unwilling to pick a side. It reminded me of family dinners from years ago, when small disputes about chores or choices would leave the table divided. I'd always stepped in then, settling the noise. Now, no one expected me to do that. They expected me to fade. But I couldn't help noticing something else. The executor's eyes rested on me longer than on anyone else. Not disrespectfully, not curiously, but with the recognition that I mattered in the room, even if no one else admitted it. That gave me a strange comfort. I didn't need to reclaim the chair to know my role hadn't disappeared. Still, the unease in my chest didn't fade. The chair itself was just a symbol, but symbols cut deeper than wood or leather. She had taken it as if history didn't exist, and that hurt in a way I couldn't explain. The executor's voice carried on, listing responsibilities, debts, and conditions attached to the estate. Each condition felt like a quiet nod to the years I had held the family together. Proof was written into every clause. This was not free. It had been paid for in labor, sacrifice, and compromise. I wondered if she heard it. I wanted to ask her directly, right there in the room, "Do you know what this cost? Do you understand why I stayed silent all these years? But I didn't. Instead, I folded my hands, watching her, waiting to see if realization would reach her without me having to force it. For a moment, she glanced up and met my eyes. It was brief, but it was enough to remind me of the child she once was, the one who trusted me without question. I couldn't tell if she looked away out of guilt, defiance, or indifference. All I knew was that something unspoken passed between us, something fragile and sharp. The executor turned the page, his pen scratched again, the sound steady and deliberate. My daughter sat straighter, trying to reclaim the image of certainty. I stayed still, letting the tension settle into me. It struck me then. Silence doesn't erase truth. It only delays its arrival. The chair was still occupied, and the executor's words still carried weight, but my thoughts shifted. I kept asking myself something simple. What did I really lose when she took that seat? It wasn't just wood and fabric. It was the acknowledgement that years of choices, years of small sacrifices were worth more than being brushed aside. Maybe that's why it stung so sharply. I had assumed they all understood, and now I saw they didn't. That realization sat with me like an unwanted guest. I found myself tracing the years backward, not with nostalgia, but with a kind of audit. I remembered the promises I kept, the late bills I paid quietly, the arguments I diffused before they could scar the family further. None of that sat on the table in front of us. Only documents did, and paper, no matter how official, could not show the weight of a life lived in the margins so others could stand taller. The executor shifted to the next section of the will. His reading was steady, but the room changed with every sentence. Each clause drew invisible lines across the table. My daughter held herself like someone determined to win, but her silence betrayed unease. Others began whispering when certain names were mentioned, their bodies leaning toward one another, carving out small alliances in real time. It was almost strange to witness. They weren't mourning loss. They were negotiating presence. My absence from the head of the table had created a vacuum, and they filled it with their own agendas. Watching this, I felt both removed and deeply implicated. They were still my children, my blood, shaped by my choices. Yet here they were, turning something sacred into strategy. A memory rose, uninvited, an old winter when the heating failed in the house. I had spent the night patching pipes, wrapping them in towels, burning through every spare blanket so the children wouldn't freeze. In the morning, none of them remembered the effort. They only remembered that the heat returned. At the time, I didn't mind. That was what a parent did. But sitting here now, I wondered if forgetting had become their habit, if my giving had erased itself in their eyes. The executor looked up again, as though measuring the air before reading the most critical portion. His gaze passed briefly over my daughter in the chair, then returned to me. It wasn't deliberate favoritism. It was acknowledgement. He knew the difference between possession and place. Then he spoke the words that pulled every ear in the room closer, the official designation of authority, the naming of who would carry responsibility forward. For a heartbeat, silence overtook the space, as if even the air hesitated. My daughter leaned in, ready to claim what she assumed was hers. But when the name left his lips, it wasn't hers. The pause afterward was sharper than any outburst. She blinked, papers still in her hands, the confidence draining from her posture before she could catch it. A few heads turned toward me, others looked away quickly, and some smirked without shame. I didn't move. I didn't need to. What struck me most wasn't triumph, but clarity. The chair had been a show, nothing more. Authority wasn't in where she sat. It was in the legacy written by choices none of them had fully seen. She had believed she could take it by posture, but the truth arrived on paper, in ink she could not rewrite. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no sound came. She shuffled her papers again, slower is time, like someone realizing their cards were empty. The executor waited patiently, his voice steady, giving no space for rebuttal. He continued reading, explaining responsibilities tied to the estate, the accountability expected of the person named. I sat still, but inside me something shifted. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was a quiet recognition that all those years of being overlooked hadn't been erased after all. They were written into the very fabric of what now guided this family forward. My daughter avoided my eyes, but I saw the weight settle on her shoulders. I didn't hate her for trying. I only wished she had understood sooner that inheritance is more than property. It's the measure of trust, of labor, of unseen sacrifices. The room exhaled slowly as the executor finished the section. Conversations began again, cautious at first, then louder, each person recalibrating their place in the new order. I remained quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence now felt different. It wasn't surrender anymore. It was choice. I looked at her one last time. For a flicker I saw the child she once was, the one who clung to me in storms, who trusted without proof. I wondered if she saw me now, not as an obstacle, but as a reminder of what she had overlooked. Whether she admitted it aloud didn't matter. The truth had spoken for itself. The announcement should have settled things, but it didn't. If anything, it stirred currents that had only been hidden beneath the surface. Authority may have been assigned on paper, yet the air was thick with unfinished business. I could feel it. The silence wasn't peace. It was the kind that arrives before someone decides to test the verdict. My daughter shifted in her chair, no longer bold, but unwilling to surrender completely. She tapped her pen against the table, a small but steady rhythm, as though daring anyone to call he are irrelevant. Around us, relatives leaned closer to one another, whispering, calculating what alliances still mattered now that the unexpected name had been spoken aloud. I knew what was coming before she even opened her mouth. Years of living under the same roof had taught me her patterns. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with caution, but her tone carried an edge sharp enough to slice the quiet. She claimed the reading had overlooked something, that her sacrifices had not been considered, that she had been the one present in ways others had not. It was an argument dressed in reason, but the weight behind it was desperation. The executor listened with patience, though his expression betrayed no sympathy. He explained again that the wording of the will was precise, legally sound, and not subject to reinterpretation. Still, she pressed on, her voice rising with each attempt, no longer careful, no longer measured. The others watched, some amused, some uneasy. I stayed quiet, but my silence wasn't weakness anymore. I wanted her to see the futility herself. I wanted her to feel the moment when pushing further would only expose her more. She turned toward me then, her eyes searching, as though hoping I might intervene. But I didn't. For too long I had spoken for her, carried her burdens and softened her mistakes. This was not my place to rescue her. This was her moment to realize that taking a chair does not make you the head of the table. Her frustration spilled into accusation. She spoke of debts she had covered, of hours she had spent handling errands when others were absent. There was truth in some of it, I would not deny that, but truth wrapped in entitlement becomes something else entirely. The executor reminded her calmly but firmly that these claims did not alter the contents of the document before him. The room grew restless. A cousin coughed loudly, another shook their head, and someone muttered under their breath about always expecting a scene. My daughter froze at that, her pride pierced not by the will but by the eyes of the family who saw her unravel. For the first time that day, she lowered her gaze. I wanted to reach out, but I stayed still. There are lessons that words cannot deliver, only experience can. And as much as it hurt to see her falter, I knew this was one of them. The executor continued reading through the remaining clauses, his voice steady, indifferent to the tension. Gradually, the atmosphere shifted. Others began to accept the outcome, if only because they had no power to change it. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, not about protest, but about adjustment. My daughter remained in the chair, but the chair no longer carried the meaning she thought it did. She looked smaller now, not because she lacked dignity, but because she realized dignity could not be demanded. It had to be lived. I thought back to the winters, the long nights, the countless small sacrifices that no will could fully capture. For years, I had believed those moments went unseen. Yet here, in this unexpected outcome, they had been recognized, even if no one admitted it aloud. The ink on the paper spoke for them. When the session ended, people rose from their seats slowly, as if leaving a theater after a play that unsettled more than it entertained. Some approached me with nods, others avoided eye contact, unwilling to confront their own relief or disappointment. My daughter stayed behind. She gathered her papers carefully, avoiding the crumpled edges where her grip had betrayed her earlier. She stood, but she didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, her eyes carried neither victory nor defeat, just the weight of realization. She stood, but she didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, her eyes carried neither victory nor defeat, just the weight of realization. We walked out of the room together, not side by side, but not distant either. The hallway felt quieter, almost forgiving compared to the charged air inside. She spoke softly, almost to herself, admitting she hadn't expected things to unfold that way. I didn't respond immediately. Sometimes silence is the clearest answer. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was release. For years, I had wondered if my presence mattered beyond the walls of obligation. That day, I learned it did. Not because a chair or a signature said so, but because even in the struggle, the truth had found its way to the surface. And maybe, just maybe, she saw it too. Walking away from that office should have ended the matter. The papers were signed, the words spoken, the outcome fixed. Yet the echo of her voice lingered in my head, each accusation heavier than the last. She hadn't only argued with the executor, she had argued with me, even when she avoided saying my name. It's strange how silence between two people can carry louder meaning than words. That afternoon, as we walked toward the car, every step we took together was filled with things left unsaid. I kept waiting for her to break it, to reach for some explanation or apology, but she didn't. She was protecting herself in the only way she knew, by pretending she was unaffected. I thought of the countless times I had done the same. Growing up, survival often meant swallowing words you wanted to spit out. I had carried that habit into adulthood, then passed it on without realizing it. Maybe that was part of why she struggled to speak openly now. At home, I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the kitchen alone. The clock ticked loudly, reminding me of the weight of the afternoon. I replayed her expression when she looked at me across the table, the mix of defiance and vulnerability. It reminded me of her younger years when she was quick to challenge rules yet quietly hoped I would still stand beside her. The executor's voice came back to me, firm but not unkind, each sentence an anchor pulling the situation to its conclusion. I wondered if my daughter had truly listened, or if she had only heard what she wanted until the very end. People often filter reality through their need, and she needed validation more than clarity. I stayed in that chair for hours, not moving, letting the memories cycle through. Family conflict doesn't end with a signature. It seeps into old cracks, widening them if you let it. I knew this was not the end of ours. That evening the phone rang. It was my sister, her tone brisk as always. She wanted details, but not in the way of genuine concern, more in the way of someone checking whether gossip aligned with fact. I kept my answers short. She pressed, asking how my daughter reacted, asking whether I had spoken up, asking if there would be trouble. I told her the truth as plainly as I could. Yes, my daughter was upset. No, I didn't interfere. And yes, I believed there would be more conversations to come. She sighed, disappointed I hadn't given her a dramatic retelling to carry to the others. After we hung up, I sat back and realized how fragile respect is within families. One moment of weakness, one misunderstood choice, and decades of work can be dismissed in whispers. That thought cut deeper than I expected. Later, my daughter finally knocked on the kitchen door. She stepped inside carefully, as if she wasn't sure of her welcome. She didn't sit immediately. She lingered, holding her phone like a shield. When she spoke, her voice was low. She admitted she had been embarrassed. She said she hadn't expected the executor to ask her for identification, hadn't thought the weight of the chair would matter until the spotlight fell on her. She didn't say she was sorry, but the edges of her confession hinted at regret. I listened without interruption, I wanted to let her finish, to see if she would reach the point on her own. She didn't. Instead, she paused and asked me if I believed she deserved more than what was written in the will. That question sat between us like a stone. It wasn't just about inheritance. It was about recognition, about whether her life's contributions had been measured against mine. I told her carefully that worth isn't always written in documents, that sometimes the people who give the most are not listed at the top, but their value is known in quieter ways. I thought she might understand, but her frown told me she heard it differently. The night ended with no resolution. She went upstairs, and I remained at the table, the silence stretching again. I felt the same ache I had felt during the reading, an ache that comes when love and disappointment share the same space. In those moments, I began to realize this conflict was not only about the will, it was about the years behind us, about how differently we had each measured loyalty and sacrifice, and until those deeper truths were faced, no paper, no chair, no signature would settle what remained unsettled. The morning after her half-confession, I woke with the uneasy sense that something was shifting beneath us, even though the house looked the same. The chair at the kitchen table, the half-empty glass I had forgotten to put away, even the stillness of the hallway. Everything was familiar. Yet there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore, as if the arguments from the office had only paused, waiting for the right moment to resume. What unsettled me most wasn't what she had said, but what she hadn't. Her words had circled around regret without ever landing there. She had asked me about fairness, but she had never asked about responsibility. That omission left me wondering if she was preparing another way to claim what she believed was hers. Later that day, I heard her on the phone. Her voice was hushed, careful, the kind of tone people use when they don't want the walls to carry their secrets. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough to know she was speaking with my sister. My stomach tightened. My daughter had reached out for an ally, and she had chosen the one person who could turn private matters into community entertainment. I stood in the hallway, listening, torn between stepping in or letting it play out. She spoke of being blindsided, of being treated like an outsider. She said she deserved more than a token share, that she had carried burdens others had ignored. When she used the word cheated, I felt my chest burn. I didn't confront her then. I waited until she ended the call, then walked into the room. She looked startled, her phone still in her hand, her eyes wide. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I asked her if she thought turning our pain into a story for others to dissect would make her feel stronger. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She wanted to defend herself, I could see it, but she also knew there was truth in what I had said. She finally told me she felt cornered, that sitting in that chair, being asked for identification, had humiliated her in a way she hadn't expected. That humiliation, she said, had followed her home and made her desperate to rewrite the narrative before it became gossip on someone else's lips. I could understand that fear. Still, I told her plainly that inviting others in would only worsen the fracture. Families heal in private or not at all. She didn't answer me. She slipped past, leaving the room, leaving the question of loyalty hanging in the air. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed louder, each silence heavier. I found myself walking through the darkened rooms, pausing at the window to look out at the street. It struck me then how little control we truly have once words are spoken. You can't pull them back. You can only brace yourself for the echo. The next morning, the echo arrived. My sister called again, her voice sharp this time. She said she'd heard enough to know the situation wasn't as straightforward as I was making it sound. She pressed me about hidden arrangements and favors owed. Her insinuations left me cold. My daughter had planted seeds, and now they were sprouting in the most predictable soil. I realized then that this was no longer just about a seat or a document. It was about reputation, about who would be remembered as honest and who would be remembered as grasping. In families like ours, memory is as dangerous as money. It decides who is trusted long after we are gone. I hung up on my sister, something I had rarely done, but the damage was already spreading. By the end of the day, another relative had called, and then another. Each wanted to test my version against what they'd heard whispered. Each conversation left me more certain that silence would no longer protect me. The betrayal was no longer subtle. It was moving out into the open. And though I wanted to believe there was still a way to steer us back toward understanding, I also knew that storms don't vanish just because we wish them away. They build, they break, and only afterward can you see what remains. I wish I could tell you that the whispers stopped once I cut the calls short, but you already know families rarely let things end neatly. If anything, shutting down the conversation only made them more curious, and curiosity mixed with suspicion is a fire no one can fully contain. When I went to the office again, the atmosphere had shifted. The executor greeted me politely, but his eyes lingered longer as though measuring what I wasn't saying. I could tell he had heard something, maybe not directly, but enough to make him cautious. The meeting was brief, almost perfunctory, yet I left feeling like the ground beneath me was thinner than before. Back home, my daughter was waiting. She didn't greet me with words, just with silence that pressed heavier than any argument could. I set down my bag, bracing for her to speak first. When she finally did, her voice was steady, too steady, the kind of tone that hides rehearsed sentences. She told me she had rights I wasn't acknowledging, that the share she wanted wasn't charity, but justice. She said she had proof, though when I asked what kind, she wouldn't show me. She just repeated that the executor would soon know the truth. I remember leaning against the counter, realizing how far we had traveled from that initial dispute in the office. What began as a simple formality had now become a trial, and we weren't waiting for verdicts from lawyers. We were handing out judgments ourselves each day in our words and silences. Later that week, another call came, this one from a cousin who lived miles away and rarely involved himself in family matters. He sounded apologetic, almost embarrassed as he explained that stories were reaching him too. He said he didn't believe all of it, but he wanted to hear my side. The phrase stung. It meant that, to him, there were now two sides to something that should have been only one. After I hung up, I sat for a long time at the table, staring at the grain of the wood. I asked myself how much of this was about money and how much was about memory. She wasn't just fighting for a larger portion, she was fighting for acknowledgement, for a version of the past where her sacrifices had not gone unnoticed, and I wondered if I had failed to give her that in time. The following evening, she confronted me again. This time, she was sharper. She accused me of hiding documents, of favoring others over her. Each word landed like a stone. I could see that she wasn't only angry, she was hurt. But her hurt had transformed into something harder, and it left little room for reconciliation. I asked her directly if she wanted to destroy me in order to win. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at me with a mixture of defiance and hesitation, as though she hadn't expected me to put it in those terms. Finally, she said she only wanted fairness, but even as she spoke, I could feel that fairness had become a word stretched to fit her own design. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I thought about how disputes ripple through generations. I thought about the times I had watched other families unravel over things as small as land or jewelry, each one convinced their fight was different, justified, necessary. And now here I was, caught in the same cycle I once judged from a distance. By the weekend, the executor called again. He asked me to clarify a few points. His questions weren't hostile, but they were precise, the kind that revealed someone else had been supplying details. My heart sank. My daughter had clearly gone further than hints and whispers. She was building a case. When I ended the call, I sat in the quiet house and realized there was no retreat left. Silence had not protected me. Distance had not softened her anger. We were moving toward a confrontation I could neither delay nor avoid. And deep down, I knew that when it arrived, it would not simply decide an inheritance. It would decide whether the fragile threads holding us together could survive at all. Looking back, I realize betrayal rarely arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, half-truths, sideways glances, and words left unsaid until suddenly they pile up high enough to block every path forward. That was where I found myself, staring at a wall I hadn't noticed being built, brick by brick, by the very people I trusted to stand beside me. In the days after the executor's call, the house felt different, not in its walls or furniture, but in how I walked through it. Each step carried the weight of conversations I couldn't predict. Each phone vibration made me pause before answering. I was no longer living freely in my own space. I was inhabiting a battleground, and the silence inside my home was no longer safe. My daughter avoided small talk, but when she spoke, her sentences cut directly to the matter at hand. She wanted documents, records, explanations. I tried to hold firm, reminding her that the process had rules, that fairness wasn't something either of us could rewrite with emotion. She didn't want to hear it. She believed the rules had always worked against her, and this was her chance to correct history. One evening, after another tense exchange, I asked her why she was so determined to turn this into war. She stared at me for a long moment, then said she'd spent her entire life watching me choose others over her. That each decision I made, even small ones, confirmed her place on the outside. I didn't know whether to defend myself or to admit she might be right in ways I had never seen. Her words weren't just about money. They were about belonging. The next morning, I drove to the executor's office again, this time unannounced. I needed clarity. I needed to know how deep her claims had gone. He received me with polite restraint, but his tone was no longer neutral. He asked about a few transactions, things I barely remembered but now carried weight because she had raised them. I answered truthfully, though each reply felt like I was feeding ammunition into a gun I couldn't see. On my way out of the office, I sat in the car longer than usual before starting the engine. The city outside looked normal. People crossing streets, buses rumbling past, shops opening their shutters. Yet for me, normal was slipping further away with each passing hour. I couldn't tell anyone that the daughter I once carried in my arms was now preparing to stand against me with papers and accusations. By the weekend, her persistence escalated. She spoke with other relatives, drawing them in. Some called me, cautious but curious, asking whether it was true I had hidden parts of the estate. Their voices carried hesitation, as though they didn't fully believe her but didn't want to dismiss her either. I could feel the balance tipping. Trust was leaving me little by little, replaced by suspicion. That night, as I sat alone, I thought about the fragility of family. We imagine love is unbreakable, but love without trust becomes a rope that frays under pressure. I wondered whether she understood how far she was pushing me, or if she believed reconciliation was still possible once this was over. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon. She entered the living room holding a folder thick with copies and notes. She didn't shout, but her calmness made the air heavier. She placed the folder on the table and told me she was ready to take her case to court if I didn't concede. The word court echoed in my mind longer than it should have. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. We had crossed the last invisible line. I looked at her across the table, and for a fleeting moment, I didn't see my opponent. I saw the little girl who once asked me to check under her bed for monsters. And I thought, almost bitterly, that I never imagined the monster she'd one day fear most would be me. But I couldn't let that moment undo me. I told her firmly that if she wanted to take it that far, then I wouldn't stop her. Her face didn't soften. She simply gathered her folder and walked away. The sound of her footsteps up the stairs was louder than any argument we had ever had. That night, I finally accepted the truth. The fight was no longer about fairness or property or even recognition. It had become a contest of endurance, who would stand longer without yielding. And I knew that before this was over, one of us would have to face a loss that could not be measured in numbers or assets. There's a silence that comes before storms, thick, stretched, and deceptive. That was the air between us after she threatened court. It wasn't yelling or slammed doors anymore. It was something heavier, the pause before the strike. And I couldn't tell whether I was meant to prepare for defense or brace for destruction. Each morning, I woke earlier than usual, listening for movement upstairs. Some days, she barely emerged, retreating into her room with her folder of papers. Other days, she made calls, her voice flat and steady, carrying through the walls. I never asked who she was speaking to, but I didn't need confirmation. I knew lawyers had entered our lives. The executor called me once more, this time with a tone I hadn't heard before. He was careful, deliberate, as if every word might one day be replayed in a courtroom. He said he had received inquiries, requests for expanded documentation. He didn't name her directly, but I knew where it came from. Hearing it confirmed what I had tried to deny. She wasn't bluffing. She had set the wheels in motion. At night, I thought of old family photographs, birthdays, holidays, the ordinary moments we once captured. I kept returning to one picture in particular, her, at maybe 7 years old, missing front teeth, holding a lopsided cake she had decorated herself. She had been proud that day. I remembered how she ran up to me, asking if the cake was good. I had told her it was perfect. How does that girl grow into the woman now preparing to stand across from me, armed with folders and claims? The suspense wasn't just in what she might do. It was in what I might say if pressed. Would I try to defend myself fiercely, risking every chance at reconciliation? Or would I concede, not because I believed her, but because I wanted to keep whatever shred of family we still had? The uncertainty gnawed at me, more relentless than anger ever could. The calls from relatives increased. Some avoided the subject, skirting around it with casual check-ins, but I could hear the curiosity underneath. Others were blunt, asking if I had really kept more than what was written. Their questions were never neutral. They carried the echo of her words. I found myself repeating the same explanations, yet with each repetition they sounded less convincing. Not because they were untrue, but because the act of defending eroded their strength. One afternoon, she left her folder open on the kitchen table. I wasn't supposed to look, but I did. Inside were pages marked with yellow notes, underlined lines, and clipped articles about inheritance disputes. At the center, she had written a single phrase in bold letters: "Take back what was stolen." I froze at that line. Stolen? Was that truly how she saw me? Not as a parent who tried, failed, stumbled, but as a thief? That one word hurt more than any legal threat. That night, the suspense reached its peak. She came downstairs, folder in hand, and said the lawyer was ready to file if I didn't respond within the week. Her tone wasn't raised. It was calm, precise, and final. I stared at her, waiting for even the faintest flicker of hesitation in her eyes, something to tell me this wasn't permanent. But there was nothing. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence drag out long enough for her to shift uncomfortably. Finally, I said that if she wanted to take this path, then I wouldn't chase her back. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded once and turned away. That small nod felt like the severing of a thread I had spent decades weaving. The suspense didn't end there. It followed me into the quiet hours of the night when sleep refused to come. I lay awake, hearing echoes of her threat, imagining courtrooms, testimonies, and the cold distance of legal proceedings. What unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of losing property. It was the possibility of losing her forever. The storm had not yet broken, but I knew it was near. Every day felt like a countdown, each conversation like the ticking of a clock. And in that waiting, I began to understand something I had never wanted to face. Sometimes, family isn't lost in sudden eruptions. Sometimes it's surrendered slowly, through silence, until the suspense becomes the final companion left in the room. Let me tell you the truth the way I felt it, not the way lawyers phrase it, not the way documents record it. I want you to hear it as if we were two people sitting across the same table, cups of tea between us, because that's how it lived inside me. When she said the lawyer was ready to file, something in me didn't just flinch, it rearranged. It made me wonder, not just what I could lose, but what kind of father I had been all along to end up here. The following week was a blur of choices I didn't want to make. Papers arrived in neat envelopes, each page written in a language that looked English but carried no warmth. I read them, but the words slid off me. My eyes went over the lines, Yet my mind kept circling back to her face. I wasn't thinking of the woman who stood before me with a folder. I was thinking of the child who once brought me drawings of stick figures holding hands. That's the face I argued with in my head, the face I pleaded with in silence. I didn't know whether to fight her or let it go. Friends told me to stand my ground, to call my own lawyer, to stop being passive. But every time I pictured doing it, I felt like I'd be confirming her worst suspicion, that I was her enemy. How do you fight without losing the last strand of connection? How do you defend yourself without becoming the very thing you've been accused of? One evening, I sat in the kitchen, papers spread out before me, when a memory surfaced I hadn't thought of in years. She was in her teens, angry after I said no to something she wanted. She told me then, "You never listen to me. You only do what you think is right." I brushed it off at the time, but now those words echoed back, sharper than before. Was this lawsuit her way of saying the same thing, only louder with more force? Maybe she didn't want money. Maybe she wanted to prove that this time her voice couldn't be ignored. The executor case pulled again, this time not neutral, but weary. He said he'd seen families destroyed by fights like this. Even if you win in court, he warned, you may lose everything else. His tone stayed professional, but I could hear something behind it. Maybe pity, maybe recognition that this wasn't really about land or documents. It was about years of distance piled up into something immovable. The house itself felt different. Every corner carried tension. Meals became brief, mechanical. I ate at one end of the table. She stayed in her room or left entirely. When we passed each other, we didn't exchange words. We just exchanged glances that lasted too long and meant too much. In those silences, I asked myself questions I didn't want answered. Did she hate me? Did she believe I had stolen her future? Or was she just protecting herself from a story she had convinced herself was true? At night, I sometimes rehearsed conversations with her. I imagined calling her into the living room, sitting her down, telling her everything she didn't know about the sacrifices I'd made, the debts I'd carried, the compromises I'd chosen to protect her. In these imagined talks, she listened, she softened. But when I tried to open my mouth in reality, the words never made it past my chest. One morning, she left earlier than usual. I watched from the window as she walked down the street, folder clutched tightly in her hand, and I thought, this is it. She's delivering it. My stomach turned, not from fear of a courtroom, but from the recognition that once it was filed, there would be no return. You can forgive harsh words said in anger. You can recover from slammed doors. But legal papers create a border. They turn fathers into defendants and daughters into plaintiffs. I sat there the whole day, waiting for a call that never came. Maybe she had filed, maybe she hadn't. The suspense gnawed at me, but underneath it was another feeling, regret. Regret that I had let it come this far without speaking the truth of my side. Regret that my silence had been mistaken for arrogance, and regret that the child I once carried on my shoulders now carried folders against me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the chair she once claimed as her own at the will reading. That chair had become more than a seat. It was a symbol of the fight between us, of who belonged where, of who was heard and who was dismissed. I thought, maybe I should let her have it. Not just the chair, but everything. Maybe surrender would show her that I valued her more than any property could. But even as I thought that, another voice inside me resisted. If I gave in completely, would she see it as love? Or would she see it as proof that I had been guilty all along? That was the trap. No matter which way I turned, I risked losing something that mattered. The days blurred, each one stretched with waiting. Waiting for her decision, waiting for the next call, waiting for a storm I couldn't stop. And in that waiting, I began to realize this wasn't just about what I would do. It was about who I wanted to be when the storm finally broke. There comes a point when waiting turns into suffocation. That's what it felt like. Days of silence where every hour carried the possibility of collapse. I told myself I could endure it, but the truth is, the not knowing was worse than the fight itself. You can brace yourself for a storm once it starts, but how do you brace for lightning that may or may not strike? I noticed the way she avoided my eyes when she came and went. No more shared meals, no more ordinary exchanges. Only the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, firm and quick, as if she didn't want to linger. Each time she passed. I thought of stopping her, calling her name, saying, "Sit down, let's talk." But I couldn't bring myself to speak. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of what she might answer. The executor's warning replayed in my mind. Even if you win in court, you may lose everything else. The words burrowed deep, reminding me this wasn't just about money or land. It was about legacy, memory, the fragile bond between a father and daughter that had been worn thin over years of missteps. Then the call came. It wasn't her, but someone from the clerk's office. A neutral voice told me a petition had been filed, her name attached to the document. I thanked them politely, but when the call ended, I just sat there, staring at the wall. She had done it. There was no going back now. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't even move from the chair for hours. My mind raced through every possible reaction. Should I hire my own lawyer and meet her blow for blow? Should I surrender and sign over what she wanted? Or should I try one last time to reach her before the courtroom made strangers of us? I decided on the last. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't calculation. It was a need, raw and unfiltered, to hear her voice without the filter of lawyers and filings. So the next morning I waited in the kitchen, listening for the sound of the front door. When she came in, folder still in hand, I spoke her name. She froze, shoulders tightening, but she didn't turn. I asked her to sit. For a moment, I thought she might walk away. But then she pulled out a chair, not the one she'd claimed at the will reading, but another, across from me. That small choice carried weight. It told me she hadn't fully surrendered either. The silence stretched. I didn't know where to begin. So I started not with the land, not with the will, but with a memory. I told her about the time she was 8 and asked if we could plant a tree in the backyard. I reminded her how I dug the hole while she dropped the sapling in, proud of her small hands covered in dirt. "That tree is still there," I said. "It grew like you did, stronger than I imagined." Her face softened for an instant, then hardened again. She said, "You always remember what matters to you, but you never listened when I said what mattered to me." The words landed heavier than any legal document, because they were true. I had thought providing working building security was enough, but maybe she had needed something else all along, to be heard, not just cared for. I told her I couldn't undo the years, but I wanted to understand her now. I asked her what she truly wanted, not from the land or the money, but from me. She hesitated, then said, "I want to know that my voice matters as much as yours. I want proof that you see me as more than a child sitting in your seat." It struck me that this fight had never been about property. It was about recognition, about her carving her place in a world where she always felt overshadowed. We didn't resolve it then. The papers were still filed, the case still waiting, but something shifted at that table. For the first time in years, we weren't just father and daughter at odds. We were two people, bruised but speaking. I don't know what the judge will decide, but as I looked at her across the table, I realized the real verdict would be whether we found a way back to each other, or let the silence finish what years of distance had started. Some conflicts feel like they belong in living rooms, whispered between family members when no one else is around. But when those conflicts are carried into a courthouse, they change shape. The air hardens. Every glance, every word, every silence becomes part of a record that can't be erased. I never imagined my daughter and I would end up here, yet the summons on my desk made it undeniable. The week leading up to the hearing was a blur. People think preparing for court is just about documents and lawyers, but it's not. It's about sleepless nights, about wondering whether every decision you made as a parent will be dissected in public. My lawyer tried to keep me focused on strategy. Stick to facts, keep emotions in check, don't let them bait you. But it felt impossible. This wasn't about strangers arguing over contracts. It was blood against blood, memory against memory. The morning of the hearing, I woke before dawn. I shaved carefully, dressed in my best suit, and sat at the table with a cup of coffee that went cold in my hand. The chair across from me was empty. I couldn't help picturing her sitting there, like she had a few nights ago, guarded but present. That image was the only thing steadying me. Walking into the courthouse was like entering a different reality. The sound of footsteps echoed off the marble floors. Strangers passed, each carrying their own burdens, but mine felt heavier because of who was on the other side of this fight. When I stepped into the courtroom, I saw her immediately. She was seated at the opposite table, papers neatly arranged, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. She didn't look at me. Not once. The judge entered and everyone rose. Formality pressed down on the room, stripping away any chance of pretending this was just another family dispute. This was official. This was binding. Her lawyer spoke first, laying out the argument with precision. Words like fair distribution, entitlement, and intent filled the air. But beneath them I heard something else. Years of her silence, now given a voice through someone paid to argue on her behalf. I listened without moving, but each phrase hit me like a reminder of where we had failed as a family. When it was my turn, I stood, my lawyer nodding for me to remain calm. I didn't try to match their polished rhetoric. I simply spoke about my intentions, about what the will had meant, about the history behind the choices. But as I spoke, I could feel the distance in her posture. Her shoulders were set, her jaw tight. She wasn't just fighting for land or money. She was fighting to be recognized as equal, to no longer be in anyone's shadow. At one point, the judge asked if reconciliation had been attempted. My lawyer answered, but I cut in. I told the judge we had spoken just days ago and that I believed there was still a path outside of this room if we chose to take it. My daughter looked at me then, finally, but her expression didn't give anything away. The session ended without resolution. The judge scheduled another date, citing the complexity of the matter. Papers were shuffled, people stood, and just like that, the hearing dissolved back into noise. But what lingered was the silence between us as we left. She walked out through one door, I through another, as though the building itself had designed separate exits for those unwilling to walk together. That evening, I sat alone again, the house quieter than ever. The hearing hadn't broken me, but it had stripped away the last illusions I held. I had thought maybe the court would force clarity, would bring everything to light. Instead, it left us in a deeper shadow. Yet something inside me resisted giving up. I couldn't accept that a judge's ruling would be the final word on our bond. A legal decision could settle property, but it couldn't mend or sever blood. That choice would still be ours if we dared to make it. So I picked up the phone. I didn't call her lawyer. I didn't draft another statement. I called her directly. The phone rang long enough that I nearly hung up, but then she answered. Her voice was cautious but not closed. I told her I didn't want the court to decide for us. I wanted her to tell me what she needed, not in filings, not through arguments, but as my daughter. There was a pause. Then she said she didn't know if that was possible anymore. Her voice cracked slightly, and in that moment I realized this fight wasn't about division. It was about hurt that had never healed. I don't know where this will end. Maybe in another courtroom session, maybe in compromise, maybe in something else we can't yet name. But I know the real battle is no longer about who gets what. It's about whether we can stop fighting long enough to remember what it means to be family. The night after the call, I couldn't sleep. Her voice stayed with me, not the words themselves, but the way they trembled. It wasn't weakness. It was weight. Years of distance, arguments never spoken, silences that had carved into both of us. I kept thinking that if she had hung up just 1 second earlier, I might have believed we were finished. But she didn't. She stayed on the line, even if only for a minute. That meant something. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. A call is one thing, but it doesn't erase court dates, lawyers, or filings. The clock was ticking toward the next hearing, and I wondered if she was already too far down that road to turn back. The next morning, I decided not to wait for answers to come to me. I drove to her house, My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they should have because I knew she might see this intrusion rather than gesture. When I parked outside, I sat for a while, staring at the front door. Memories rushed back, dropping her off after school, watching her run inside with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, hearing her call out goodbye without looking back. Now, that same door looked like a barrier I wasn't sure I had permission to cross. I knocked. For a long stretch, nothing. Then the door opened, just a fraction. She stood there, guarded. No smile, no warmth, but she didn't shut it. That was enough for me to ask, quietly, if we could talk inside. She hesitated but stepped aside. The house smelled faintly of brewed tea and something floral. Everything was neat, yet it carried a tension, as if it had been arranged for defense rather than comfort. We sat in the living room, a space filled with pictures of her children, her life, but not a single one of me. That absence cut deeper than any sharp word. I told her straight. I didn't want the court to decide what was between us. I wanted us to decide, even if it meant hard truths. She looked at me, really looked, as if weighing whether my words had weight or were just a strategy. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "You always had the power, and you never asked what I needed. Why should I believe this time is different?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The steadiness made it undeniable. I sat there, my throat dry. It would have been easy to deny it, to defend myself, but that wasn't what she needed. For once, I had to stop talking like a parent explaining and start listening like someone being held accountable. So I told her I was ready to hear it all, what she had carried, what I had ignored, what still felt raw. She didn't let it spill out at once. It came slowly, in pieces, as though each word cost her something. The years when she felt invisible, the comparisons to her brother that she never asked for, the moments she won, Ted me to step in and didn't. It wasn't about property, not really. It was about being seen. I listened, and for the first time in a long while I didn't interrupt. I didn't justify. I just let her speak. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the sound of the clock on the wall. Then she asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything. "If I walk away from this case, how do I know you won't forget this conversation tomorrow and go back to deciding everything on your own?" I didn't have a rehearsed answer. All I could say was that I didn't want to win or lose against her anymore. I wanted to stop being an opponent. I admitted that I couldn't rewrite the past, but I could choose differently from this moment forward. She didn't respond right away, but I could see something shift in her face. Not forgiveness, not even agreement, but the slightest release of tension, like a door had opened, just enough for air to pass through. We didn't resolve it that day. She made it clear that the case was still on the table, that she wasn't ready to abandon it on the strength of one talk. But she also said she would think about another path, one that didn't involve strangers deciding what belonged to us. As I left her house, I realized the suspense wasn't in the court date anymore. It was in whether she would believe me when the next choice came. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of something that had been missing. Not certainty, not peace, but possibility. Walking away from her house that evening, I carried more than her words. I carried the weight of all the pauses between them. She had not promised peace, but she had left the possibility open, and that was more than I had dared to expect. Still, when I returned home, the silence of my own living room pressed in. A conversation, no matter how raw, doesn't dissolve years of mistrust in a single sitting. For the next few days, I found myself replaying what she said, not the accusations that I could live with, but the question she left hanging. How would she know I wouldn't slip back into old habits? That question stuck because it was true. Trust isn't rebuilt by a single statement. It's measured in the days that follow. And the days ahead were leading us back toward the courtroom, whether I liked it or not. The summons arrived again, a reminder that while we had spoken as family in her home, the law had its own timetable, one that didn't pause for reconciliation. Seeing that envelope on my table felt like standing at a crossroads where one path led back into conflict and the other demanded more courage than I had shown before. When the morning of the hearing came, I woke early. The air felt heavy, and though the city outside was moving in its usual rhythm, for me, time slowed. I chose my clothes with care, not out of vanity, but because I wanted to walk into that room not as a man ready for battle, but as a man ready to be seen differently. Still, as I adjusted my tie, I knew appearances meant little if my actions failed to follow. Arriving at the courthouse, I saw her before she saw me. She was standing near the entrance with her lawyer, her shoulders squared, her face steady. For a moment, I felt the distance between us more sharply than ever. But then she looked up, and our eyes met. There was no smile, but there wasn't anger either. Just recognition, as if we both understood this wasn't only about property or paper. It was about whether we could step out of a cycle we had created together. Inside, the atmosphere was as sterile as before. The same walls, the same echoes, the same ritual of sitting across from each other. But something had shifted, and I could sense it in the way he held her pen, the way she glanced at me, the way her lawyer leaned closer to ask if she wanted to proceed as planned. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and I felt the formality wrap around us like armor. Yet as the case resumed, I realized I couldn't rely solely on procedure. The last conversation with her had stripped me of the illusion that the law could fix what was broken. The judge began asking questions, pressing for clarity. Her lawyer spoke first, outlining her position, emphasizing her rights. Then my turn came. My lawyer whispered notes in front of me, but I shook my head. I knew this wasn't about a clever argument. When I stood, I spoke directly, not with legal jargon, but with something closer to honesty. I admitted that the conflict had gone beyond what it should have. I acknowledged that mistakes had been made, many by me. I said I didn't want this courtroom to define our relationship, even if it decided our case. I asked for time for us to settle this as family, not as adversaries. There was a pause after I finished, the kind of silence that makes every second stretch. The judge leaned back, studying both of us. My daughter didn't look away, and I held her gaze, waiting for her to respond. Her lawyer leaned in, clearly unsettled by my deviation from the script, but then she spoke. "I need to know this isn't another performance," she said, her voice firm but without hostility. "If I agree to pause, I need to know we're not wasting more years pretending." The courtroom wasn't the place for full confessions, but the weight of her words pressed against me. I answered the only way I could, by saying I was prepared to prove it, not by winning an argument, but by changing how I showed up day by day. The judge, perhaps recognizing something in both of us, granted a temporary adjournment. The case wasn't closed, but it was suspended, giving us space. As we walked out, I felt the tension of the room lift slightly. She didn't rush off this time. Instead, she walked beside me for a few steps before stopping. She didn't promise anything, but she didn't turn away either. It wasn't reconciliation, but it wasn't rejection. It was the start of something in between, fragile, uncertain, but alive. That night, I sat again in the quiet of my home. The court hadn't solved it, but it had forced us into the same space where we couldn't ignore each other. And in that forced space, a door had opened, not wide, but enough to suggest that neither of us truly wanted to see it slammed shut forever. I didn't expect silence after the adjournment to feel so heavy. You'd think relief would follow, the kind that comes when a storm passes and you finally hear yourself breathe again. But instead, every hour after the hearing felt like waiting for the next strike of thunder. The case wasn't over. It was simply paused. And pauses, I've learned, can be more unsettling than endings. What do you do when the court has stepped back, but the questions between you remain louder than any gavel? That's the place I found myself in. The days that followed weren't filled with dramatic gestures or long speeches. They were quiet, almost ordinary. Yet within those ordinary hours, I started noticing choices that mattered. I called her, not to argue, not to revisit the past, but to ask simple things. Did she need help with the boys' school forms? Was the garden fence finally fixed? I expected her to shut me down, but she didn't. She answered cautiously at first, like someone stepping onto thin ice, testing whether it could hold. One Saturday, she surprised me. She asked if I'd like to join her for lunch at a small diner near her office. It wasn't sentimental. She said she had an opening in her day and figured it was easier to talk in a neutral space. But to me, that invitation was more than a meal. It was a test. We sat across from each other at a corner booth. The hum of conversation around us gave us cover, and for once, we weren't locked into formality. She spoke about work deadlines, the exhaustion of parenting, and how she sometimes wondered if she was carrying more than she could manage. I listened, and for the first time in years, I didn't jump in with solutions or criticisms. I just listened. That lunch didn't fix us, but it created something small, an opening, and I carried that opening like a fragile seed, unsure if it would grow or wither. Still, I knew what was waiting. The court date hadn't disappeared. It was only delayed. Each shared moment with her reminded me that we were trying to plant something in soil that had been scorched by years of mistrust. Could it take root, or would the old battles return once lawyers stepped back into the room? When the second hearing arrived, I walked into the courthouse with a different kind of weight. Not the weight of anger, not the weight of defense, but the weight of knowing what was at stake went beyond inheritance papers. It was about whether we could prove to ourselves that family bonds meant more than legal victories. She was already there, her face steady, her lawyer flipping through notes. I took my seat, my lawyer beside me, but the hum of strategy around us felt distant. What mattered wasn't the documents on the table. It was whether we could carry the fragile progress we had started outside these walls into this room. The judge called us forward. The lawyers began, rehearsing familiar points, but halfway through my daughter raised her hand gently. She asked to speak for herself. That startled me as much as it did her lawyer. She stood and said, "We've both wasted enough years on arguments. I don't want to erase what he's done for me, and I don't want to erase the harm either. But I don't think this room should decide how we move forward. I think we should." Her words hung there, clear and steady. The judge listened, then turned to me. My lawyer nudged my arm, but I shook him off and stood. "I agree," I said. "I don't want the final picture of us to be transcripts and rulings. I want it to be something we chose, even if it's not perfect." The courtroom went quiet. For the first time in years, we were on the same side, not of an argument, but of a choice. The judge, perhaps recognizing that, granted us mediation time outside of court, urging us to resolve matters privately if possible. As we left that day, she didn't walk ahead of me or behind me. We walked side by side. We didn't say much, but we didn't need to. There was still work ahead, still mistrust to untangle, but for the first time it felt like both of us wanted to try. Not because the law demanded it, but because something deeper did. That night, sitting in my quiet home, I realized this. Reconciliation isn't a single act or grand declaration. It's a series of small choices, repeated until they form a path. And for the first time, that path seemed possible. When I look back, I realize every demand, every confrontation was really about testing how much of myself I was willing to surrender. But somewhere along the way, I stopped reacting like a cornered parent and started acting like someone who had earned the right to choose peace on my own terms. Dignity isn't handed over. It's reclaimed, often quietly, in the decisions no one expects you to make. That's where the real empowerment lives, not in shouting the loudest, but in standing so firm that others can no longer push you off balance. And if you followed me through this chapter, then you already sense how fragile that balance is. What happens when the fight doesn't end, when the demands shift into something even more unexpected? Imagine being told there was still one last fee to settle, only for the tables to turn in a way no one saw coming. That next part of the journey is where control flips and where you'll see how even a single dollar can rewrite an entire family's story. Stay with me, because you'll want to witness how that unfolded.